In the comments under a recent video about the Chernobyl accident, many viewers asked for a more detailed account of the process of mitigating the accident's consequences, and I'm happy to fulfill this request, especially since there's much confusion, rumors, and legends surrounding what happened in the first hours and days after the accident. Even the famous HBO series, in my opinion, paints a somewhat distorted picture of events at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant on April 26th and the following days. It's important to clarify up front that we will analyze events from the perspective of our present-day experience, where we have detailed and complete information about the condition of Reactor 4 of the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. Unfortunately, the decision-makers in April, May, and even June 1986 did not have such information readily available. In those days, obtaining even basic information about the reactor's condition was a literal struggle, requiring significant effort and resulting in losses. Therefore, it's not surprising that not all decisions made at that time were correct, although it's important to note that the consequences of those mistakes were significant. Around 1:24 a.m. on April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 of the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant was destroyed by a series of powerful explosions. As a result of these explosions, the reactor and the reactor hall above it were almost completely destroyed, with serious damage to adjacent structures. The top of the reactor was blown off, then fell back under its own weight, rotating at a certain angle and creating a gap through which remnants of the reactor were freely exposed to the atmosphere. Uranium has very low natural radioactivity, so fresh fuel assemblies are almost safe from a radiation standpoint. However, the fission products of uranium in a chain reaction are often highly radioactive. Therefore, the longer a reactor operates, the more radioactive waste accumulates inside it. On the night of April 26, 1986, a huge amount of such substances was released into the environment. Of the approximately 200 tons of nuclear fuel in the reactor, about 120 tons were expelled from the active zone by the explosion. By comparison, the Little Boy nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima contained only 64 kilograms of radioactive material. But that's not all. In addition to the fuel, the explosion released about 1,100 out of 2,500 tons of graphite moderator from the reactor, which had accumulated significant radioactivity over time in the intense neutron fields of the operating nuclear reactor. Some of the ejected radioactive debris remained as relatively large fragments, soon falling to the ground on the station's premises and in its vicinity. However, a significant portion of the radioactivity was in the form of gaseous and volatile substances, primarily xenon and iodine. Additionally, some nuclear fuel and graphite were released into the atmosphere as fine dust, capable of lingering in the air for a long time before gradually settling on the ground, even at considerable distances from the reactor. Later, one of the key tasks would be to prevent the spread of contamination to even larger areas, its infiltration into groundwater, and so on. But that's a story for later. Let's begin our account with the events of the night of April 26th, when the shocked personnel of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant had to be the first to confront radiation. Moreover, they had to do so practically blindly. Consider this fact, for example. Until midday on April 26th, no one knew, or at least acknowledged, that Reactor 4 of the power plant was destroyed. That is, that it ceased to exist as an intact structure. Today, it's hard to believe, but the personnel of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant based their actions that night on the belief that the reactor was intact. This error determined the nature of the actions of the personnel, among whom, along with necessary and absolutely essential tasks, there was a lot of unnecessary and subsequently, as it turned out, harmful activity, things that others had to laboriously rectify later. However, in the conditions of monstrous radiation fields prevailing at the reactor after the explosion, any unnecessary action was, in fact, equivalent to something harmful for the life and health of those performing it. What were the radiation levels like? They varied quite widely, from units to hundreds of sieverts per hour, or as they said then, from hundreds to tens of thousands of Roentgens per hour. Simply put, there's no point in comparing these levels with normal levels, which are about 0.5 millionth of a sievert or 50 millionths of a Roentgen. such large numbers don't convey much to our minds. To put it differently, a dose of 1 sievert, more accurately, 1 gray, causes acute radiation sickness. 3 sieverts carry a 50% probability of a lethal outcome, and a dose of 4 to 5 sieverts is considered lethal. Such doses could be accumulated within tens of minutes amid the ruins of Reactor 4, and Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant employees spent many hours in such conditions. It's astonishing that only 28 people succumbed to acute radiation sickness after the accident. However, the people who found themselves in such inhumane conditions were unaware of this. Paradoxically, it's a fact. There wasn't a single operational dosimeter at the station capable of measuring such radiation levels. All they had were several dosimeters measuring up to 1,000 microroentgens, 10 microsieverts per hour, which of course were off the charts even in the most calm, radiation-safe areas. The nature of this situation became broadly known only on the morning of April 26. Up until then, the liquidators were essentially working blindly. It's important to underscore that a significant portion of the radioactive contamination came from dust particles dispersed into the atmosphere by the explosion. Along with the air, this radioactive dust entered people's lungs, introducing extremely harmful sources of alpha radiation, streams of helium-4 atom nuclei traveling at high speeds. Alpha particles are relatively massive, and therefore their impact on the body is extremely destructive. On the other hand, alpha particles have very low penetrating power, so they are usually shielded by even a thick layer of air. This is why, for example, working with uranium, which also emits alpha radiation, can be done without special radiation protection measures. Unfortunately, when alpha sources enter the body through dust inhalation, they can fully realize their destructive potential. This is precisely why respirators and similar devices were extremely necessary for radiation protection during the accident aftermath. However, there were none available at the station on the night of April 26th. What tasks did the station employees and the firefighters arriving to help them have to solve in the first hours after the accident? First, localize the immediate consequences and prevent the spread of the accident. In this regard, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was, to put it mildly, not very well designed. All 4 power units were interconnected, and the emergency 4th and 3rd units were even located in the same building, literally through a wall from each other. Scattered around the station were glowing fuel fragments, sparking numerous fires. If these were not extinguished, the fires could disrupt life support systems and damage other power units. Simply put, multiplying the consequences several-fold. And there was plenty at an atomic station to burn and even explode. Simply put, hydrogen, significant quantities of which were contained in the station's generators to improve heat exchange and reduce friction and component wear. Plus, significant amounts of oil in the same generators and other devices. And if you think about it, there was much more, including flammable bitumen on the roofs and so on. This immediately raised the first group of tasks. Extinguish the fires. This was done jointly by personnel and firefighters, and prevent the threat of new fires. Drain oil, displace hydrogen with non-combustible nitrogen, and so on. Tasks where firefighters, of course, could no longer assist, leaving them entirely to the station personnel. In addition to this, employees had to urgently restore at least the emergency life support systems of the reactor, because everyone was convinced the reactor was intact, and it was crucial to prevent its destruction. In other words, firstly, stop the chain reaction, and secondly, ensure its cooling to avoid overheating. It's important to note that even after a complete shutdown of the reactor, it still needed to be cooled. As mentioned earlier, a significant amount of radioactive isotopes accumulates inside the reactor as a result of the chain reaction, substances whose atom nuclei are inclined to spontaneously split, releasing heat, albeit incomparable to that released during the fission chain reaction, but still significant. If you leave even a shutdown reactor to itself, over time, it will begin to heat up rapidly, capable of reaching enormous temperatures, causing the reactor's nuclear fuel and structural elements to melt and merge into a giant molten drop. This is why, in any serious nuclear power plant accident, 2 things must be done first. Shut down the reactor, then ensure its reliable cooling. However, The Chernobyl accident was not just any accident. And on the night of April 26th, there was no need to shut down or cool down Reactor 4 of the power unit, simply because there was nothing left to shut down or cool down. However, neither the personnel, nor the management, nor indeed anyone in the world knew this at the time. So, task number 1, shut down the reactor. To do this, as we recall, it was necessary to ensure the insertion of all neutron-absorbing control rods into the active zone. The command to do this was given even before the accident, but it wasn't possible to fully insert the rods due to channel deformations along which the rods moved. Therefore, at the reactor control panel, it was indicated that the rods had only descended to 1/3 of their length and could not go further. Initially, the shift supervisor, Akimov, de-energized the devices responsible for rod movement, hoping they would lower into the reactor under their own weight. This, of course, achieved nothing. Nor could it. There was nothing left to lower, nowhere for them to go, everything destroyed by the explosion. However, at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, they didn't know this, and the shift supervisor of the 4th power unit, Alexander Akimov, sent 2 engineers, Alexander Kudryavtsev and Viktor Proskuryakov, to manually lower the rods, a task that could be performed from the reactor's central hall. Kudryavtsev and Proskuryakov didn't even manage to reach the goal of their initially pointless journey. There was too much destruction. However, this was enough for them to receive lethal doses of radiation. Both would die in mid-May in the hospital. By then, people were beginning to suspect that the reactor was likely destroyed. According to the recollections of participants, one of the first to voice such an opinion was Valery Perevoschenko, the shift supervisor of the reactor workshop, but he was not listened to, and attempts to accomplish the impossible continued. Since the control rods containing neutron-absorbing boron carbide are not entering the reactor, this substance can be delivered there by another method: adding a boron-containing substance, such as boric acid, soluble in the cooling water system. However, this water, whether with boron or without it, still needs to be supplied to the reactor, which is easier said than done. The emergency reactor cooling system was deliberately disabled before the experiment. It's impossible to activate it from the control panel because the panel is without power. Additionally, the cooling system was severely damaged by the explosion, with some pumps destroyed and others left without power. Valves on the cooling system pipes are closed. All of this needs to be fixed, mostly manually, again, all in those monstrous radiation fields. The shift supervisor of Unit 4, Alexander Akimov, and the senior reactor control engineer of Unit 4, Leonid Toptunov, personally engaged in this work for several hours along with other workers, each receiving deadly doses of radiation. Their sacrifice was not in vain. With their heroic efforts, they only made things worse. The water, painstakingly delivered through the reactor ruins, seeped into the spaces beneath the reactor, washing out radioactive dirt. The resulting radioactive brine will later be pumped out with great difficulty, exposing many liquidators to high doses of radiation. As time went on, more and more station employees began to suspect that trying to save the reactor was futile. Even the director of the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, Bryukhanov, who consistently reported to Moscow that the reactor was intact, likely had a gut feeling that this was not the case. Otherwise, why would he recommend the evacuation of Pripyat on the night of April 26? Bryukhanov's suggestion was rejected, which is understandable. If the reactor was intact, then there was no immediate danger. The station's chief engineer, Nikolai Fomin, asked the deputy chief engineer for operations, Anatoly Sitnikov, to climb onto the station's roof and assess the condition of the reactor hall and the reactor itself from above. This moment, by the way, was depicted quite disgustingly in the HBO series Chernobyl. Supposedly, trembling with fear, Sitnikov was escorted by a soldier who practically forced the engineer onto the roof. Nothing of the sort happened, of course, and could not have. Sitnikov knew perfectly well what was at stake and conscientiously did what was necessary. After his rooftop visit, he toured almost the entire block and confirmed that the reactor was destroyed, reporting this to Fomin and Bryukhanov. They didn't believe him, and Sitnikov left to participate in the accident response, ultimately receiving a lethal dose of radiation. He would die on May 31st in a Moscow hospital. By noon on May 26th, specialists alerted by the emergency began arriving in Pripyat. A group led by the chief engineer of the Ministry of Energy, Boris Prushinsky, flew around the station by helicopter and confirmed that the reactor was destroyed. Prushinsky reported this information to the governmental commission that had also arrived in Chernobyl by then, specifically to the USSR Minister of Energy, Anatoly Mayorets. Only then, 12 hours after the explosion, did the idea that the reactor of Unit 4 of the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant essentially no longer existed slowly begin to dawn on those responsible for the accident response. The task of saving the reactor naturally disappeared on its own, as there was nothing left to save, and the liquidators focused on solving other problems related to containing the consequences of the accident. The first question they faced was whether the chain reaction of fuel division was still ongoing within the reactor ruins. If so, it needed to be extinguished at all costs. Military dosimetrists armed with neutron flux sensors were sent to reconnaissance the reactor, because the presence of such a flux is the surest sign of an ongoing reaction. The initial reconnaissance results were grim. The dosimetrists reported the existence of sufficiently powerful neutron fluxes, indicating a continued reaction. Fortunately, physicists quickly realized that these data could be inaccurate. Powerful gamma radiation emanating from the scattered radioactive debris could interfere with the instruments, causing false readings, essentially seeing neutrons where there were none. Therefore, an alternative method was devised. Using helicopters, air samples were taken from the reactor, measuring the content of iodine-134. Iodine-134 is produced in an operational reactor and gradually decays after its operation ceases, with a half-life of only 52 minutes. In other words, after the chain reaction stops, the concentration of iodine-134 will rapidly decline. Measurements showed a low content of iodine-134, leading to the conclusion that the chain reaction had indeed ceased. The second most important problem was the fire continuing within the reactor's depths. The reactor graphite was burning, heated by nuclear heat and reacting with the oxygen in the air. This graphite was highly radioactive, and as it burned, it emitted large amounts of radioactive soot, exacerbating contamination. Therefore, the fire needed to be extinguished. Water is not suitable for this. Inside the reactor ruins, the temperature averaged 300 degrees Celsius, reaching up to 1,000 degrees. Once inside the reactor, water would have rapidly evaporated, only contributing to the removal of radioactivity. It was decided to take a different approach, sealing the reactor crater by covering it with sand. This would have prevented oxygen access to the fire's core and ultimately extinguished it, as well as halted emissions. Besides sand, dolomite was also decided to be dumped into the reactor. Upon heating, it decomposes, releasing carbon dioxide gas, which would also inhibit combustion. Additionally, dolomite decomposition absorbs heat, so its introduction should have helped lower the reactor's temperature. Furthermore, the reactor was bombarded with lead. The calculation was that lead would melt inside the reactor, which also requires heat. Moreover, lead, which absorbs gamma radiation well, would help form something like a shield, protecting against radiation. As planned, dozens of helicopters flew to the reactor, bombarding its core with all these materials. From April 26th to May 2nd, over 5,000 tons of various materials were dropped into the reactor, and eventually, the fire was successfully extinguished. The conditions under which the helicopter crews had to work were extremely challenging. To achieve even remotely acceptable accuracy, bombing had to be conducted from an altitude of 200 meters, where radiation levels reached 300 Roentgens, approximately 3 sieverts per hour. Even 20 minutes in such conditions almost guaranteed radiation sickness. Protective measures like shielding the helicopter bottoms with lead helped little, and they were not applied immediately. In general, the work was quite something, and most importantly, not at all guaranteed to yield any useful results. For example, skeptics cite figures like these. As we mentioned earlier, of the 2,500 tons of graphite released after the explosion, about 1,100 tons were ejected from the reactor, meaning roughly 1,500 tons remained inside. The rate of graphite burning in the reactor was estimated to be approximately 1 ton per hour. And if this estimate was correct, if the reactor had been left undisturbed, allowing the graphite to burn naturally, the fire would have extinguished itself in about 6 days, by the 2nd of May. In reality, emissions continued until May 6th. That's why many accident researchers believe that the reactor bombing operation essentially brought no benefit and may have even worsened the situation, providing the fire with new fuel supplies in the form of sacks and parachute fabric used to drop materials into the reactor. Other experts, including, for example, academician Legasov, on the contrary, believe that the operation was successful, reducing oxygen access to the reactor, decreasing the intensity of burning, and preventing additional pollution from entering the environment. In any case, all this does not diminish the heroism of the helicopter crews, who selflessly and at risk to their lives and health carried out the task assigned to them. Another important front in the Chernobyl battle was efforts to prevent the so-called Chinese syndrome. This term emerged in the 1960s in the United States to describe an extremely severe nuclear accident involving the meltdown of the reactor's active zone. The idea was that a molten drop consisting of fuel and reactor structural elements, known as corium, could burn through the reactor structures and penetrate into the ground, heating up further due to the energy released by the decay of the radioactive elements contained within it. The term Chinese syndrome was somewhat of a joke, implying that such a drop could burn through the earth and reach China from the United States. This, of course, is an exaggeration, but there's little humor in it. By penetrating deep into the ground, radioactive masses can contaminate groundwater with radiation, which would have extremely negative consequences for the ecology of an entire region and the health of its residents. To be precise, the task of combating corium broke down into essentially 2 different subtasks. Firstly, it was necessary to remove water from the rooms located beneath the reactor, primarily from the so-called bubbler pools. After all, if the molten corium were to burn through the reactor's floor and then the floor of the so-called steam distribution corridor and reach these pools, contact between radioactive water and molten substance would lead to, if not an explosion, then a sufficiently powerful steam generation, resulting in the release of large amounts of radioactive substances. The most challenging task was draining the lower bubbler pool. 2 valves that needed to be opened to accomplish this were located in a room flooded with radioactive water, 3 meters deep beneath the reactor. This operation is linked to one of the most widely known episodes, the mission of the so-called Chernobyl divers. Shift Supervisor Boris Baranov of the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, Senior Turbine Control Engineer Valery Bespalov, and Senior Reactor Control Engineer Alexei Ananenko. Through the efforts of the media, particularly Soviet media, a legend was born that all 3 volunteered to sacrifice themselves for the good of humanity. In reality, it was not quite so dramatic. Baranov, Bespalov, and Ananenko went to the bubbler pool simply because it was their shift, and they possessed the necessary knowledge of the reactor's layout for the task's successful completion. These individuals had no intention of risking their lives for the betterment of humanity. Everything was carefully planned to minimize work time, anticipate all possible contingencies, and mitigate adverse circumstances. By the way, according to Ananenko's recollection, the water in the corridors was knee-deep, albeit highly radioactive. Baranov stayed at the entrance to the necessary room, while Ananenko and Bespalov each opened one of the valves, then quickly left the scene, as radiation levels were still quite high. Unfortunately, Ananenko did not remember the radiation levels they received, but according to him, they were, I quote, "not shocking." All 3 divers lived many more years. Baranov passed away in 2005, and Ananenko and Bespalov, if Wikipedia is to be believed, are still alive today. In parallel, measures were taken to prevent the Chinese syndrome. A massive reinforced concrete slab was constructed beneath the reactor, with channels for its artificial cooling using liquid nitrogen. The work took about a month, involving over 800 miners who truly had to work in the most challenging conditions, shaped not only by high radiation, but also temperatures reaching 40 degrees Celsius in the tunnels beneath the reactor. During these works, many miners received doses far exceeding permissible limits, even by inflated Chernobyl standards. As it turned out later, all these efforts were also in vain. Most of the corium solidified into a massive block, the so-called elephant's foot, inside the so-called room 272. Small portions also seeped into the bubbler pools, already present when the pools still contained water. The corium masses did not progress further. To burn through the reactor's foundation, they simply lacked the mass and thermal energy, as much of the fuel was ejected from the reactor during the explosion and therefore could not become part of the corium. However, this information was only substantially discovered later, around September 1986. At that time, in April and May, the leaders of the Accident Response Headquarters did not have this information, making it perhaps logical to prepare for the worst-case scenario. Around June 1986, the first, most acute, and dramatic part of the events related to the localization of the Chernobyl accident's consequences concluded, and the second part began. An epic that lasted until November 1986, involving the construction of the shelter object, also known as the sarcophagus. Concurrently, efforts continued to decontaminate the areas around the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, prevent the entry of radioactive mud into nearby rivers, especially the Pripyat and Dnieper, and other such tasks. But if my dear listeners are interested, I will delve into this further in one of our upcoming videos dedicated to the Chernobyl topic. Well, for today, that's all from me. Take care, and until next time.